So if you've spent any time watching the videos on my channel, you know that I focus a lot of effort on helping photographers maximize apps like Lightroom and Photoshop to get better looking landscape photos. After all, like one of my favorite ways to relax is to just randomly select a photo from my library and see what kind of creative treatments I can apply. But there's something important to be said about the step before editing, which is the composition. And that's when you're out in the field with your camera and you're looking for that next creative shot. Now, we all know the common rules when it comes to establishing an effective composition. Rules like the rule of thirds, clear subject placement, and the use of leading lines. But the more that I've grown as a photographer, the more that I've come to understand that there are rules to follow for effectiveness, but there are also rules to follow for creativity. So in this video, I'm going to share with you some creative landscape photo composition tricks that'll help you leave the scene excited to edit the images that you just took. It's going to be a lot of fun, so let's dive in. All right, so here we are in Lightroom Desktop, and I've got a collection of photos that will help me illustrate the 5 tips that I want to share with you about getting more creative landscape compositions. And so for this first tip, what I want to talk to you about is leading lines. And so I just mentioned leading lines in the intro, but there are different ways that you can use leading lines. There are just kind of ways to get the job done, and there are ways to be even more creative. And sometimes being creative and being effective, they kind of are married together. And I think that this tip here for more creative leading lines, I think that is a perfect example of that. So you can see here, I took this photo at Death Valley National Park, and the boardwalk is clearly meant to draw the viewer's eye up through the frame and over to the right. And it's fine. Like, this is an effective use of leading line. The eye kind of starts kind of down here and then it goes up and then to the right. But if I go over one image, same boardwalk, but do you see how I decided to put the boardwalk at more of an aggressive angle? So it's cutting through the majority of the frame. So the eye kind of cuts through here and then up here, and then it explores the rest of the scene. So if we compare the two, again, this is good. This is fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. But I do think that there's something to be said about thinking about how dominant the leading line is in your composition. And I have other examples of that. So here, the idea of leading lines can also be a matter of perspective. So depending on how high or low you are with your camera, you can also be more effective and creative with the leading line. So this photo, the camera's it's low to the ground, but it's for the most part with the horizon line a little bit higher than center frame. And the primary leading line is the trail here leading to the sailing stone. Now, if we go over one, you see how I tilted the camera down a little bit. So I went from this to this. And so you're almost looking down at the rock. I would argue that the leading line created by the trail is not really as effective as the next image. But by doing that, we made a more interesting composition because the horizon line was brought further up in the frame, which I think is more pleasing. If we go back here, you can see that the sky, it's not really doing much to lend itself to the composition. And so when we look here, because I tilted the camera down, it does have a bit more of an effective composition. However, there is something to be said about also changing or looking around, as long as it's okay, as long as you're not destroying the scene, whether there are more effective ways to illustrate the leading lines. So what do I mean by that? Well, notice here, obviously this is a more dynamic scene because we are at sunset, so we have this really cool sunset. The sky looks beautiful, but I went from kind of this angle of the rock to going in front of it, and you now have a much longer leading line. It's a lot more interesting. Same thing with this photo here. Again, I kind of want to illustrate not just kind of looking around, which I'm going to cover in another tip as well, but by changing the perspective. So I tilted the camera down. So here you can see the horizon line also a little bit higher than center frame. And then here, by tilting down and getting closer to my primary subject, this to me is my favorite of all the examples. This is the most powerful use of leading lines. I took some creative liberties with the editing process where I really brought out the trail. So it's definitely defined. But I would say that this is a much more interesting use of the very common rule of using leading lines. Again, don't forget, that it's okay to put the horizon line further up in the frame. I know a lot of people want to kind of show something like this where you have more of the sky, and you can argue that this is a good use of it because the sky is very interesting. But this is also an interesting sky because of the sunburst here. I just feel like the star of the show is the rock, and you have this really awesome leading line. All right, so for tip number 2, as landscape photographers, it means usually that we like to be out in nature, probably away from people and probably away from man-made structures. But the truth of the matter is that sometimes it's just unavoidable to have man-made structures, whether they're bridges or signs or things like that. And that's okay. I think that there is a challenge that photographers should kind of take upon themselves to see, like, all right, there's this thing here. Is there a creative way for me to incorporate it into my composition? And so that's what tip number 2 is. So, as is the case here, so you could almost argue in this kind of a composition that the star of the show actually is this kind of beaten up fence, and the way it kind of, again, leading lines, the way it cuts across the frame and then goes back this way. That was very intentional. I took this on the big island of Hawaii, and you can ask yourself, all right, if I were to remove this entire fence, or if I, found a composition where the fence was not in here, would it be worth taking? And I would argue, no. I think that the fence and the little wildflowers in the foreground, it adds a really nice kind of dichotomy between what's man-made and what's natural. And that was the challenge that I kind of gave upon myself in terms of seeing whether I can find something interesting with nature and man-made structures. Same thing here. So this is in Norway, and there are a lot of man-made structures here, and there's obviously some very dominant, powerful natural landscape subjects like the mountain, the water, and of course the reflection of the mountain in the water. But you've got this entire little village here, and you have this dock. And so again, ask yourself the question, would this image be interesting or worth taking if I were to, say, position the camera over here so that the dock is completely out of the frame, and if I were to remove all of the houses and structures here? And I would argue that maybe it could be because the mountain is obviously really nice and the reflection is nice, but I intentionally took a few steps back so that I saw the way the dock kind of cut into the frame here. It adds almost a leading line of itself, and it draws the eye through the frame, which is always like one of the most important things that as a photographer you need to do. You need to figure out how to effectively draw the viewer's eye through the frame. And so using man-made structures like this can help with that. Same thing here. So again, if this tractor was not in the frame, would this be an interesting composition? Yeah, to a degree. It's a beautiful tulip field, and you can see that it was just after sunrise, so the sun was still pretty low over the horizon, and you get this beautiful rim light against the flowers. But the way that I position the tractor, kind of almost relegating it as kind of a part of an ensemble cast, it's just another subject here. It's not the primary subject, but it does draw the eye through the frame. And it is also an interesting composition because I guess the owners painted it pink. So there you go. Now, there are also creative ways to kind of pit man-made subjects versus natural ones, and that has to do with paths. I love this photo because it does a beautiful job of pitting one path, which is clearly man-made. You've got kind of this, heavy metal here, and it's just it's very clearly man-made. And then you've got almost like a V. You've got this other path that was created by nature. I mean, this water was just creating its own path, and you can see all of these fallen tree limbs and tree trunks. I don't know. I love this. Like, yes, I could have stood closer over the rail and just gotten a photo of the path over here. I could have also stood over here and just taken a shot this way, but I really do enjoy incorporating man-made elements. Now, this is similar to the previous tip, the first tip where I was talking about with the sailing stones at Death Valley, where you want to make sure that if you do have the opportunity and it's allowed to kind of explore whatever that man-made subject is. So here you can see there is this man-made bridge over the water. And what I want to show you is in the next 4 images, it's the same bridge. I just explored different creative ways to capture it. And also, there are different editing treatments, but I don't want to pay attention to that. I want to just show you how here you have kind of like, I walked up to the shot, I found a creative composition where the bridge cuts through the frame, but also you've got the water curving around. So this is a lot of fun. And I also kind of used this tree trunk here as a natural frame. But when I go here, you can see that I was standing over there in the previous shot and I walked all the way here, and it's kind of like a reverse shot. So in this photo, the bridge is almost kind of like the dominant player, but here the bridge is relegated kind of to the background and the focus is on the water flowing this way. I also got closer to the actual bridge itself and shot down. I talked about this with the sailing stone, like, it's okay to shoot down onto your subject and it creates these really interesting leading lines. And then also I went below it. So again, with man-made subjects, it's okay to incorporate them. You don't have to remove everything. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I have to clone out all signs of life, of man-made life. It's okay to include it. I would just challenge you to think of creative ways to incorporate it. Like, here, like I showed you, there were 4 different ways that I incorporated the same man-made structure. All right, so for my third tip, this has to do more with the actual lens that you're using or the focal length. And really it has to do with experimenting with lenses and focal lengths that maybe you wouldn't naturally or instinctively pair with the subject. So here, this is a very, very oft photographed subject. That's Mesa Arch in Canyonlands National Park. And you can see that I used my Sony A7R and the Sony 24 to 70 millimeter lens. It was at kind of like a pretty middle of the road 48 millimeters. And based on where I positioned myself, in this particular composition, I got, I really tightened up on the bottom of the arch and so that you can see through it. Same thing with this next shot. Again, also, this is the same 24 to 70, but it's at the widest 24 millimeter. And I would argue that probably these focal lengths are some of the most common that photographers use for these kinds of shots, that kind of middle of the road 24-70. And so I also wanted to change things up. I got my shots here, like these 2 shots I'm really happy with. They're pretty conservative shots in terms of the lens choice and the focal length and the composition. But there's another lens that I've talked about many times. I've written about it a bunch, and it's the fisheye lens. Like the fisheye lens, to me, I don't know whether I can justify telling you to just go out and buy a fisheye lens. It is, a niche lens, but I've called it the funk buster for many years, because if you ever find yourself in a creative funk where you're just like, man, I just can't get out of this. All of my photos look boring. I'm not excited about it. The fisheye lens is amazing. And I've owned 2 of them. I've owned the Canon 15 millimeter f2.8 fisheye, and Sony made a 16 millimeter fisheye lens. And also Sony makes a fisheye adapter for their 28 millimeter lens. The 28 millimeter lens that they have, it's not very well known. It's not super popular, but I love that there is this kind of snap-on fisheye adapter, which I have. But here, again, these are the 2 kind of standard shots that I think a lot of people get. But then what happens when we go and get a little funky with our focal length? And so here you can see you've got this beautiful, I love this. You've got this photo here and then this photo. So what I did was I used the distortion that you get with the fisheye to get a more creative composition. Like this to me is a ton of fun. Yes, like these 2 photos are great. I love them and they serve their purpose. But if you're looking for something different, I would really recommend trying different focal lengths that, with lenses that maybe, are collecting dust. Or you can always try just renting a lens. If you're going on a trip and you can't justify buying a fisheye lens, which I completely understand, go ahead and rent one. I really do think that the fisheye, it's one of those things where it's very easy to overdo, like a lot of things, but it can really break through any creative blocks that you have, as is the case here. Like the arch really does take on a completely different life compared to the versions of the photo taken with a 2470. All right, for tip number 4, we're sticking with lenses, except we're going the completely opposite route. So with tip number 3, I talked about the fisheye lens, which is generally an ultra wide focal length. But for tip number 4, we're going to talk about the telephoto lens, but it's not what you think. I want you to kind of reimagine how you would approach a telephoto lens. And it doesn't have to be a zoom lens. It can be a telephoto prime lens. But there is one application in particular that it's pretty much the one of the main reasons why I still pack my bigger, heavier, like 100 to 400 millimeter lens. And that's to use it to create panos. So here you can see this is a photo I took at the Dolomite mountain region in Italy. And if I were to have used a wide angle lens, I can tell you that I would not be able to get this kind of compression and presence, because with a wider focal length, the mountains would look like they're further away and they would have a bit more distortion. And so how could I get the best of both worlds, where I want to present the viewer with kind of a wide angle shot, but I still want to retain the compression and the presence of the mountain? You can see this was taken with my longest lens, the 100 to 400 millimeter telephoto zoom lens by Sony. But you can also see that what I did was I set the camera and lens vertically. I took multiple bracketed shots. This is a single row pano. You can see the resolution here. Like if I were to open up the calculator and I'll do 19898 times 7527. I mean, that's 149 or 150 megapixels right here. What does that mean? So not only am I able to present the viewer with a wide angle composition, but I also have a resolution for days. So if I zoom in here, I mean, this is nuts. You would not be able to do this easily if you took a comparable single image photo with a wide angle lens. Again, you would lose that sense of compression. Things would look like they were further away. You would also have a little bit more distortion, and you wouldn't be able to zoom in. Like I love that. I love being able to zoom in here. I can create different photos from this single image because it's got so much resolution here. So I have a few different examples of this. Same thing here. Like for me, I always bring some sort of a longer focal length. In this case, I was going with primes. And so I had my Zeiss Bodice 135 millimeter f2.8 lens. And same thing, it's a single row pano, but I love that I still get the wide angle composition. I get that sense of compression. So there's a sense of distance and relationship from the foreground to the background. And I get resolution. So I can zoom in and get these really high detail sections of the overall composition. If we move over here, this is actually a different type of pano. This is what I call a multi-row pano. So basically what I did was I created 2 rows. I took a series of photos on one row, and then I lowered the camera a bit, and I took the same series of photos right below it. And so you can see like this top half is one row, and it has, I would say, I think 4 or 5 shots. Same thing on the bottom row. And then what I did was I used Lightroom to stitch them together. But again, same Bodice 135 millimeter lens. And this is just not something that you would get with, if I were to use, say, a 24 millimeter or a 16 millimeter lens. This kind of mountain range here, this is Zion, Kolob Terrace. This would look a lot further away. But here I can zoom in and you can see all of that wonderful detail because I have so much resolution. Also, you get this beautiful sense of depth. The trees in the foreground are rendered out of focus. The background is nice and sharp, and you get all of that lens compression, which I love. And then finally, one more example here. This was taken in Colorado during the fall. And same thing here, my Zeiss Bodice 135 multi-row pano. This is 2 rows. And I just really like here, like the way the foreground is kind of out of focus. When you do these panos, especially as multi-row panos, what you want to do is you obviously want to lock in your exposure, but you also want to lock in your focus. You don't want the camera adjusting focus from shot to shot. So set the lens to manual focus. And in this case here, I focused in the background. Because I did that, we have this beautiful separation from the foreground to the background. And again, I have tons of resolution, tons of detail to zoom in. If I want to, I can create, a separate photo just by zooming in. And I think that makes things a lot more versatile and a lot more creative. All right, so to round things out is tip number 5. And tip number 5 for landscape photographers is analogous to tip number 2, which was being more creative with man-made structures, except this has to do with people. So again, at least for me, one of the reasons why I love landscape photography is I just love getting out into nature and just me and my camera, and I'm just doing my thing. One of the kind of bonuses is just getting away from people. But that's not to say that including people can't make your photos more effective, especially when you have to introduce a sense of scale. Sometimes when you take a photo of a subject, for the viewer, it might be hard to visualize just how big that thing is. And when you incorporate a person, when a viewer looks at a photo, we are really good. Our brains are really good at identifying generally the height of a person. And when you understand that, when you have that as kind of like your anchor point, everything else in terms of scale falls into place. So here, this is a photo I took years ago. It's actually the cover of my book called The Visual Palette. Now, this is my buddy, Brian Bonham, and I'm 6 feet tall. And Brian is a few inches taller than me. So he's not a short dude. And so someone who's 6'2", if you can imagine standing here, you can then imagine just how tall this waterfall is, just how much of a precipice, if he were to fall, how far he'd fall, how big these trees are. It's just, it really does a wonderful job of introducing a sense of scale because I'm using a person. Same thing goes here. Now, the key difference is in this shot, Brian is kind of like a very tiny part of the overall composition. He's there to kind of lend a sense of scale, but you can understand how he's actually really, really small. This is Brian as well. This was taken in California amongst the redwoods. And the reason why I had Brian stand here was I wanted to give a sense of scale of just how absolutely gigantic these redwoods are. So again, Brian is 6'2". And so what I did was I stood closer to Brian. I didn't bother to introduce the height of the redwood. I figured that just by showing how wide it is, the girth of the tree trunk, also just how tall it is. Again, Brian's about 6'2". So it gives an impression of just how big these trees are. Also, you can kind of see them behind him. All of these trees are massive. And so by having Brian here, again, this is similar to the man-made structure tip, where ask yourself whether the photo would be worth taking without that subject. So sure, this is an awesome photo. If I were to clone Brian out, this would be really cool. But having Brian here introduces this wonderful sense of scale that adds more kind of incredulousness to just how big these trees are. Same thing if we go here. So Brian's not in any of these photos. These are just some random tourists and a photographer. The reason why I included them here is because seeing just how massive the waves were as they were crashing against over here against the shore. And you can kind of identify the average height of these people. You can visualize like, okay, this person, also might be about 6 feet tall, and just kind of multiply how many people standing shoulder on top of shoulder, this wave, how tall it is. So to me, again, the people are here for a reason, to introduce this sense of scale. And then this last example here goes, again, kind of the opposite way. So you've got this guy kind of perched over here on the ledge, this kind of rock face over here, but it gives a sense of just how gigantic the ocean is and just how far of a fall it is. Again, it kind of goes the opposite of this photo and this photo. It's more akin to this photo over here, except I would say that it just gives an even grander sense of scale. And so there you go. Those are 5 kind of creative, outside of the box tips that I wanted to share with you to improve your landscape composition. So when you go out, think about these things. Think about how you can incorporate them with your own photography. And again, if this kind of stuff is exciting to you, like you want to kind of improve your landscape photo editing workflow, then please do check out my course called Lightroom Landscapes. And it's not just a bunch of videos that teach you like, all right, this is how we edit our photos. The reason why I created this course is because I wanted to provide you with a functional and repeatable workflow so that you approach your photo editing in a structured way. By doing that, it'll make things more efficient and more creative. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. And if you want some more outside of the box editing tricks for your landscape photos, check out this video here. Of course, if you found this video helpful, a thumbs up is always appreciated. Be sure to click on that subscribe button and bell icon to get notified of all future videos. Thanks a lot, everyone.